Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the final talk of the Stained Glass Museum's autumn webinar series. I'm delighted to see over 50 of you joining us live this evening for what is going to be a fantastic talk. Very excited to hear our speaker, David Caron, speaking to us about Irish stained glass this evening. Okay, so it is time to introduce our speaker, David Caron. Dr. David Caron was born in Dublin and studied visual communication at the National College of Art and Design. He later returned to the National College of Art and Design as a lecturer and was subsequently appointed as head of department. There he worked alongside the formidable Nicola Gordon-Bow, a leading authority on the arts and crafts movement in Ireland and author of monographs on Irish stained glass artists Harry Clarke and Wilhelmina Geddes. And indeed, along with Professor Nicola Gordon-Bow and Michael Wynne, David was one of the three original compilers of the first edition of the Gazetteer of Irish Stained Glass, published in 1988. His PhD research at Trinity College Dublin focused on the stained glass artist Michael Healy and the artists of An Túr Gloine. I didn't probably pronounce that very well, but we're going to learn how to pronounce that this evening. The Tower of Glass for those of us who are anglicised. David has written articles on various aspects of Irish stained glass over the years, and this summer, as I'm sure you've seen, he published a new, revised and updated edition of the Gazetteer of Irish Stained Glass, which has some fantastic colour illustrations and also includes a number of panels from the Stained Glass Museum's own collection. So we will hear a bit about that this evening, and David's talking, of course, on Irish stained glass, and he's going to kind of give us some highlights and focus on some of the artists working right from the foundation of the Glass Tower studio in the early 20th century to contemporary artists working in stained glass in Ireland today. So without further ado, over to you, David, and thank you very much for agreeing to give us this talk.
Thank you, Jasmine. I hope everybody can hear me. So when I agreed with Jasmine to give a talk on this theme, I was a bit daunted. So as I was saying, I chose 10 artists and it was not easy. And no doubt another person would make a different selection with equal validity. I'll show the 10 artists in chronological order, finishing with 2 living artists. Ultimately, as there is so much ground to cover, it can only be a superficial introduction to the subject of Irish stained glass. And whatever about my commentary, I think you'll enjoy the richness and variety of the images, most of which were taken by the specialist stained glass photographer, Joseph Fertel. Jasmine also asked me to speak a little bit about the recently published, revised and expanded edition of the Gazetteer of Irish Stained Glass. It's essentially an index of the best and most interesting stained glass in Ireland, listed county by county, and windows created by Irish artists which can be found overseas. There's substantial representation of windows to be found in England, with somewhat less in Scotland and Wales, and of course, many throughout the world. There are also 2 essays and short biographies of the key artists. So I'll now move on to the presentation proper. At the turn of the 19th century, a few informed individuals, dismayed at the artistic quality and craftsmanship of stained glass in Irish churches, and the fact that so much was imported, particularly from Germany, decided to remedy the situation. They looked to Christopher Wall, the leading arts and crafts stained glass artist and educator, and he arranged to send over his favorite student, Alfred Ernest Child, to Dublin. Child arrived with a dual mandate to set up and teach stained glass classes in the Dublin Metropolitan School of Art, promulgating Wall's stained glass philosophy, and also to establish a stained glass studio which would employ the cream of his students. Thus, An Túr Gloine, or the Tower of Glass, was born, officially opening on the 1st of January 1903. The very first windows which appear in the An Túr Gloine order books were 3 apse windows for the newly constructed Catholic Cathedral in Loch Rey, County Galway. This slide shows the Annunciation, or a detail of, which is very closely derived from one of Wall's slightly earlier windows, that for All Saints, Dogmersfield, Hampshire. The other 2 apse windows were also based on Wall's designs. It is thought that Child had not designed any significant windows prior to his arrival in Ireland, and this probably accounts for him recycling his master's designs. We know that the new recruits to the studio, still very much learning the craft, worked on this window, the most talented of which was Michael Healy. Although there is no doubting Child's key role as an educator and craftsman, several of his students quickly outstripped him. However, over a career in An Túr Gloine of nearly 4 decades, he created about 130 windows, and this one, made in 1918, is the one he considered to be his best. It is in Dublin's Unitarian Church, and although not remarkable from a creative standpoint, it is interesting from a thematic and iconographic point of view, as it explores the themes of discovery, truth, inspiration, love, and work. And in the slides, you'll notice the inclusion of wall-inspired leafy boughs and canopies which frame the figures. However, one wonders if Wall would have appreciated the overly illustrative predella panels, as he, in his own words, advocated, "Keep your pictures for your walls and your windows for the holes in them." I'll show you a few more details from it. Christopher Columbus, and if you look at the very bottom in this slide, you'll see a little kind of colophon for An Túr Gloine. Florence Nightingale, in 1918, she wasn't long dead, and here she is ministering to soldiers. And if we look in the far right, and this is typical of a child, little details, the sentry standing in the snow, and above this very extensive tracery, including 2 rose windows, this one taking 2 of the principal themes, love and work, and combining them together. So love, husband and wife, presumably, and work, busy harvesting the crop. Michael Healy, born and raised in a single-roomed Dublin tenement flat, had a most unpromising start in life. However, he had a few lucky breaks along the way. The first was when a Dominican priest, for whom he worked as an illustrator, took him under his wing and arranged for him to study in Florence for 18 months, had a profound effect on his career and his artistic development. His second break came when, at the age of 30, he joined An Túr Gloine. This is the top section of Michael Healy's first window, that of Simeon, also in Loch Rey Cathedral, and it was his first solo window. He created it in 1904. He had been recruited to An Túr Gloine based on his drawing prowess, and one can see this in the masterful depiction of the aged Simeon, seen here holding the infant Jesus with his eyes raised to heaven, singing the Nunc Dimittis. This window, along with 2 others from Loch Rey, were exhibited at the St. Louis World Fair, which gives an indication that already the quality of An Túr Gloine glass was being recognized. Note the subtle integration of Celtic strapwork decoration in the saint's cloak and mitre, and the saint's name inscribed in Gaelic lettering of the type derived from Celtic manuscripts. An Túr Gloine was to a degree associated with the Celtic revival movement. The name of the studio is drawn from an ancient Irish legend, and in the first 2 decades or so of the 20th century, many of the windows, particularly those featuring Irish saints, featured Celtic decoration. I'm now jumping ahead by 2 decades to show an example from the midpoint of Healy's career, a single light of Doubting Thomas and Judith, which he made for a remote rural church in County Louth. Like many of the studio's patrons, the priest who commissioned it was a very discerning individual, and he commissioned several windows from An Túr Gloine for this and for a neighboring church. The main subjects of the window were selected to commemorate a local farming couple, Thomas and Judith Traynor. There was wonderful dramatic tension, difficult enough to achieve in stained glass, I think, when Thomas reaches out, about to touch Christ's hand bearing the stigmata. As with many of Healy's windows, the delight is in the detail. In the distance, up on the left, there's a tiny rural scene of whitewashed cottages set against a hillside and a lake, sort of bringing County Louth back into the picture. The other main part of the window is this stunning and arresting panel, and it must have been quite shocking when it was first revealed to the local congregation. It depicts the temptress Judith, dressed in her silver lame gown, about to sever the head of the drunken General Holofernes, with the blood-red curtain of the tent foretelling his gruesome end. And here we have Judith looking defiantly out to the viewer. And Holofernes oblivious to impending death by sword. Elsewhere in the window, there are several charming vignettes. This one of rural industriousness, a lone farmer steering a plough, being driven by 2 oxen, may be a tribute to Thomas Traynor himself, though there is a scriptural origin in Ecclesiasticus, which Healy references in the window. And this is maybe my favorite bit. Centrally placed between Judith and Thomas is another figure from Ecclesiasticus, that of the potter, and I'll quote from Ecclesiasticus. As the clay is in the potter's hand to fashion it in his pleasure, so man is in the hand of him that made him, to render him as it liketh him best. And this tiny little vignette is only about 6 inches square. Okay, so towards the end of his career, Healy created a series of large windows, mostly located up high, and by now his style had become more pared back, more graphic, though still employing a large degree of asting, which gave them their signature sparkling jewel-like effect. While Simeon was his first solo window in Loch Rey Cathedral, The Last Judgment was his final work for the cathedral, taking 4 years, though he worked on other commissions concurrently. So the top 2/3 of the window are essentially all about symmetry and balance. And there we've got an angel reading out the names. And there's sort of a phalanx of angels either side looking on. And then down below, our eyes are drawn to the lower section where the drama really unfolds, and we witness what fate befalls those who come before God's judgment. The saved, hands clasped in prayerful serenity, seem to be bobbing about in a tranquil ocean. However, the damned, by comparison with their contorted faces, appear to be writhing in boiling liquid. Among the main opposition studios to An Túr Gloine in the early decades of the 20th century was the Clarke Studio, founded by Leeds-born Joshua Clarke in the late 19th century. But by 1915 or thereabouts, it was increasingly identified with one of his 2 sons, the incomparably talented Harry. When a new chapel at University College Cork was being built, it's in the Hiberno-Romanesque style, it was understood by An Túr Gloine that they would furnish all 17 windows. However, when the person overseeing the project got sight of the talent that was Harry Clarke, he swiftly had a change of view and gave 9 of the windows to Clarke, which consolidated his reputation as the rising star in Irish stained glass. St. Gobnet of Ballyvourney is a local saint, and she's the patron saint of beekeeping. So Clarke utilizes a honeycomb pattern in her blue dress with several large bees featuring prominently. It's a wonderful profile. And then this is the apex of the window. We see St. Gobnet shown using her crozier to draw a white line across which the plague cannot pass into our community and affect those who have taken refuge there. On the right, one of the inflicted looks remarkably like a raddled version of handsome young Harry Clarke himself. This is the figure in green, and one can see he has included his initials and the date on the figure as if to confirm this. This example also shows Clarke's interest in the macabre and the juxtaposition of beauty and elegance with ugliness and the grotesque, which is a fairly common feature in many of his works. So now moving on to the Eve of Saint Agnes, also by Clarke. He was not only a supremely talented stained glass artist, but he also maintained a parallel career as a leading illustrator. And you might be able to tell that from this image. Arguably, he was more at home interpreting secular themes rather than religious ones. During his career, he undertook 2 labor-intensive, highly detailed, multi-paneled windows, both derived from literary subjects. The Eve of Saint Agnes is inspired by John Keats's poem of that name, and it's only about 5 feet high. It was created for a private Dublin home of a wealthy businessman and now is in Dublin City's art gallery. The story is set at night time on a cold winter's night in a draughty castle. The dramatis personae appear in the frieze at the bottom and include the beautiful Madeline and her controlling father, Lord Morris, Madeline's heroic suitor, Porphyro, and her devoted maid, old Angela. I'm just going to show a few more panels. I mean, just each and every one is exquisite. You can really get drawn into them, and they're just stunning. Okay. While Clarke clearly delighted in detail, he was also well capable of tackling large windows which required to be viewed at a distance. The Last Judgment in Newport, County Mayo, was one of his final windows, created while he was slowly dying of tuberculosis and spending considerable periods of time convalescing in Davos, Switzerland. Ultimately, although he designed the window, only the left-hand light was completed under his supervision. One of the considerations when speaking about Clarke's windows is the need to distinguish which windows he designed and executed in totality, which he designed and partially worked on, and which ones he designed and supervised. The late Nicola Gordon-Bow, the leading expert on Harry Clarke, as Jasmine has mentioned, divided his stained glass output into 3 categories, as I've indicated. To further complicate things, though, Clarke died early in 1931. However, the Harry Clarke Studio continued until 1973, and too often windows created long after he died are erroneously attributed to him. By 1912, when the Belfast artist Wilhelmina Geddes joined An Túr Gloine, there were already 5 other artists working there in addition to A.E. Child, but within a few short years, it was clear Wilhelmina Geddes was an exceptional talent with a particular artistic vision. Among her earliest windows were a series of war memorials featuring archangels and male saints in heroic mode. Some were of modest scale, including this one, although it included 6 vignettes in addition to the full figure of Saint Michael. It was actually made 6 years before Clarke's Eve of Saint Agnes, and one can see some parallels in terms of scale and interest in narrative. However, while Clarke's delicate figures glide about, Geddes's figures are often tense, sinewy, and robust, and ready for and engaged in action. This window, one of 2 by Geddes, which were created for a small Church of Ireland church in Inver, County Antrim. It was made in 1923 and depicts St. Patrick and St. Columba, the 2 male Irish saints most often featured in Irish windows. Geddes's powerful depiction of Ireland's patron saint depicts him as essentially a man of work and not of letters, unlike the more scholarly St. Columba. And there, I think the painting is just stunning, and the intensity of the expression. There's St. Patrick and close-up of his face. And I'll just go back to that for a sec because it's just so amazing. And then in his sinewy hands, we have a little chapel to indicate that he was the founder of indeed many churches around Ireland. In the base panel, Patrick is depicted in an altercation with an emissary of the pagan King Lyra, who remonstrates with him that the saint had the audacity to light a paschal fire which outshone the beacon on the hill of Tara created for the great annual pagan gathering. Now here we have St. Columba. So if Patrick is depicted as a sturdy man of action, by comparison, St. Columba is shown as a somewhat more ascetic figure, a man of letters, and accompanied by his symbol, the dove, which is a play on the Latin of Columba, obviously. And in his right hand, he's clasping his Cathach. This is a legendary manuscript associated with him. And in the base panel, we see the aged St. Columba, discovered by his followers on the brink of death, slumped on the altar of his monastery at Iona. And if we look a little closer, you'll see that the saint's figure is illuminated not only by the lantern that his followers is holding, but also by two angels, about to take his soul to heaven, and they're both carrying little candles. And at the very bottom, there's a frieze of holy men bearing candles in the saint's funeral procession, led by three angels in green, ruby, and blue. And for those with a particular interest in Geddes, Nicola Gordon-Brough, as Jasmine indicated, brought out the life and work of the artist 6 years ago. It's a work so comprehensive that it will always be the definitive resource on Geddes, just as Nicola's earlier works are on the life and work of Harry Clarke. So along with Geddes and Clarke, the third big name in Irish stained glass is Evie Home. She arrived late to stained glass, having established herself as one of Ireland's leading abstract painters, responsible, and indeed largely derided at the time, for introducing modernism from the continent to Ireland. Deeply religious in her 20s, she had spent 18 months training to be an Anglican nun in Cornwall, and she much later became a Catholic convert. And she discovered that stained glass was an effective medium for her to express her spirituality. So despite her earlier enthusiasm and commitment to abstraction, once she embraced stained glass in the mid-1930s, her windows were mainly figurative. This window, one of the 7 Dolors of Our Lady, was an interesting commission as it was begun by Michael Healy, but he died halfway through the series, and it was Home, and they worked alongside each other at An Túr Gloine and highly regarded each other, who took over where he left off. In fact, in one of the 7 windows, it literally is half Healy and half Home, though with no compromise in style by the latter. It's quite a bizarre window. Hone had admitted an ability to convey a range of deep emotions when it was called for, as in the deposition, with Our Lady wringing her hands in grief at the death of her son. Hone, well acquainted with the wonders of medieval glass, often drew her inspiration from that period. Never shy of using colour in all its glory, sometimes her windows take on an almost folk art quality, as conventional perspective and relative scale are dispensed with in favour of overall composition and narrative considerations. And if we just focus on the bottom, here are the 3 wise men arriving at the nativity bearing their gifts. Despite being significantly physically limited due to contracting polio as a child, she had a prodigious output over a 3-decade career, or 2-decade career, I should say. In addition to many large windows for churches, it is estimated that she created about 150 small panels. Some were probably practice pieces for much larger commissions, but others were made just as small panels, such as this very tender depiction of the angel Gabriel at the Annunciation. Made about 15 years before she died, kind of a mid-career piece. Finally, in terms of Home, this image is a preliminary design of which she made many for her largest commission. It was a gargantuan window for the chapel at Eton College, and was made near the end of her career after she had left An Túr Gloine and had set up her own studio in semi-rural County Dublin. The Crucifixion and Last Supper was created between 1949 and 1952, completed 3 years before she died, and can be viewed as one of her crowning achievements. Joseph McBrien, one of the contributors to the Gazetteer, is currently researching the life and work of Evie Home, which will be published in book form and which will be keenly awaited. Richard King can be viewed to some extent as a transition figure in the context of 20th century Irish stained glass. Another deeply spiritual individual, he was born 13 years after Home and trained as an assistant under Harry Clarke in his studio. When Clarke died in 1931, it was King who was appointed manager, a position he held for a decade. This depiction of St. Elizabeth was created 3 years after Clarke died and remains very true to the Harry Clarke house style. In fact, the silhouette recalls St. Gobnet in some respects, though obviously the color palette is very different. I'll show a close-up of it. For someone as intrinsically creative as King, there must have been a tension between maintaining the legacy of the revered Clarke and yet accommodating his own artistic development. And so over the years, the Clarkes, we see his style evolve and slowly create his own and very distinctive interpretation of Harry Clarke's signature style. Aged 32, he left Clarke's and ended up taking a lengthy sabbatical from stained glass, partly influenced by the difficulty in importing the raw materials for the craft during the period of the Second World War, or as we called it in Ireland, the emergency. As an accomplished illustrator and graphic artist, he was never short of work. So by the time King returned to stained glass in the late 1940s, early 50s, he had reinvented himself, and although there was some residual influence from his period at Clarke's is discernible, his new work is very fresh and vital. And I'll show you two details from this window. So definitely not to be mistaken for Harry Clarke. But I think at the same time, we can see some influence, but he had a much more angular approach and often introduced a lot more tonality than Clarke would ever have done. In time, Richard King became more and more influenced by modernism, which was always deeply informed by a particular interest and commitment to theology, and he was very keenly interested in developments in Catholic teaching. Detail of the Paschal Lamb. Virtually all his works were for Catholic churches and convent chapels, and this particular one is in a convent chapel in Wicklow town, and it has a spectacular collection of stained glass, some much earlier stuff from the Harry Clarke Studio by his colleague William Dowling. Although many of King's commissions were windows for existing churches, when there was a new build opportunity, he could certainly rise to the occasion and create a strong scheme of windows, always underpinned by a strong theological basis. This example, one of a series of for a chapel in a nursing home run by religious sisters. And unfortunately, at a certain point, some of the windows were reordered, so it's not quite the scheme as was originally intended by King, but it's still stunning. Patrick Pye, somewhat of a maverick character. He died aged almost 90, only 3 years ago, and he would have been very well known in Ireland as a painter, specifically a painter of religious subjects, almost exclusively religious subjects. His stained glass output, by comparison, is sadly hardly known, even though it spans most of his career. The majority of his windows have a narrative content, but sometimes he chose more obscure incidences from the scriptures, which without any accompanying notes left by the artist can present a challenge to interpret with certainty. This is one of Patrick Pye's very earliest windows, dating from 1961. It was made for the porch of a small County Galway church. Brimming with exuberant colour, it depicts scenes from the lives of Mary and Joseph. And I think you can kind of figure out most of them, one or two perhaps a little bit more obscure. And I'm going to show you a detail of one of the more obvious ones. It's the bottom right section with St. Joseph sawing away in his carpenter's workshop. The next window I'm going to show you by Pye is actually in the same church, but it was made 25 years later and shows to an extent the influence of El Greco, who is one of Pye's heroes. So many of Pye's figures have this kind of sort of elongated look about them and somewhat tortured look as well. And here we have Christ praying in Gethsemane with an angel carrying a golden chalice hovering above. But we also have the entombment and we have the resurrection. So kind of three scenes within the two lights. And I'll show you some close-up. So he had a very kind of particular painting style. He often eschewed any details. So many of his faces don't have any any visible expression or features as such. So he relied a lot on kind of on gesture. Okay. So moving to people who are a couple, in fact, Johnny and Rosheen Murphy. Classes in stained glass at the Dublin School of Art ceased after A.E. Child died in 1939, and there was an interregnum until Cork-born Johnny Murphy, who also had trained at Clarke Studios, like many others, reintroduced them in the mid-1950s. Like A.E. Child, he was not only an instructor, but also a practitioner. He and his Belfast-born wife, Rosheen Dowd Murphy, along with another former Clarke employee, Des Devitt, established a hugely productive studio. So I'll now show you two examples of their work. At the period that the studio was flourishing, there were a lot of new Catholic churches being built in Ireland. And unlike previous decades, when the parish priest or minister might order a single window at a time, often the commissions came from progressive architects who wanted the entire church filled with glass by the same studio. These images are from a very large Cork suburban church, the Church of Our Lady Crowned in Mayfield, and Murphy Devitt Studios provided all the glass. The images you're looking at are only of the windows on the choir gallery, which is a vast gallery, and it's a fraction of what can be viewed in the church. Created in 1962, they are a collaboration between Johnny and Rosheen. Johnny would always devise the overall scheme, whereas Rosheen had a very lyrical, painterly approach. Sometimes one would work on the cartoons and the other would paint the figures. Trying to untangle who exactly did what in any specific job is not always easy. And I've had discussions about that with their daughter, Raeltine, who I think might be tuned in to the presentation this evening. Brimming with bright colors, they exude confidence and vitality, perhaps how the Catholic Church itself saw itself in this period of expansion. And I'll finish Mayfield with this close-up of one of the angelic musicians. Apparently Rosheen didn't like wings on angels, so although they're angelic and they are wingless, but angels all the same. A few years later, Murphy Devitt were entrusted with a substantial scheme for the new build chapel of a boarding school in County Kildare, Newbridge College. This is one of the windows. The main themes were drawn from the Book of Revelation, including subjects such as the four men of the Apocalypse. Again, devised by Johnny, these dramatic, sometimes violent and even gruesome depictions no doubt went down very well in the boys' school. And here are three of the four horsemen of the Apocalypse. The bottom on the white horse is trampling on, it's a whole pile of skulls. So it's a very dramatic window, as are most of the windows in the school. But there's also some abstract clear glazing as well, or at clear story level. So there's a very nice counterpoint to the very figurative windows. But I'll show you a detail of that figure with kind of the cool, chilly, almost looked like the head is hewn out of a block of ice, and he's carrying what looks like a length of chain in his arm. Okay. George W. Walsh is the son of George Stephen Walsh, and George Stephen Walsh had trained at Clarke Studios. George W. served his apprenticeship under his father, initially in Belfast. George Sr. worked at Clokey's, a well-regarded studio there. And then in Michigan, where the family lived for 6 years before returning permanently back to Dublin in 1963. And they created wonderful work there, worked on very large schemes, and where they enjoyed budgets that wouldn't have been available in Ireland largely at that point. Initially working in Abbey Stained Glass Studio after George W. returned from the US, for most of his career, he worked independently and has been enormously productive. That's an understatement. In some of his earlier windows, it can be a bit difficult to distinguish his style from his father's. His windows often draw on the context of where they are situated. So for this window, in this instance, the window is in a university chapel and depicts the rather novel idea of Christ sitting down, debating with the students. And you'll see on the ground a tennis racket and a hurl used for the Irish game of hurling. The majority of Walsh's work has been for Irish churches, though he has undertaken many secular commissions too. This window, although located in a former Church of Ireland Synod Hall, was actually commissioned for an interpretive museum, Dublinia, which was established in the Synod Hall venue. Located on St. Michael's Hill in the heart of Dublin, we see the figure of the Archangel swooping downwards. However, the main visual interest is focused on the traditional medieval trades associated with the city, which occupy the lower section. So they're really delightful and typical of George, full of visual interest and full of activity and detail. And you could just spend hours. There's a companion window in Dublinia, also by George, which has kind of a panoramic scene of Dublin city. Okay. Here is one of a series of 11 two-light windows in the Catholic Church in Eyeries, West Cork. In addition to a range of religious subjects, they feature a variety of secular and historic themes which resonate with the local community. This is again very typical of George, connecting with the community. This window deals with the age-old theme of emigration. Note not only the traditional curragh boat, the large 19th century sailing ship, but also the jet. And in the very top in the spandrel, you'll see a satellite dish alluding to the importance and relative ease nowadays of emigrants being able to keep in touch with those they've left behind. A more recent commission here is in Belfast. It's a tabernacle screen and entrance doors for the Church of the Holy Family, and it was made in 2007. This elliptical shaped church is entirely filled with windows by George, some essentially abstract, such as these, and others comprised of figurative vignettes drawing on local as well as scriptural references. These days, as well as creating smaller scale stained glass panels, George Walsh has been working with fused glass, often creating freestanding pieces suitable for exhibitions. So he's working as hard as ever. And I'm on to the final artist, Peter Young. He's perhaps we could be described as mid-career, and he is the only living Irish artist represented in the collection of the Stained Glass Museum, though there are works by Clarke and Hone and Geddes. And this small panel, the one in the museum, has the quirky title of Sure Enough, the Duck, and it was acquired for the museum at his first solo exhibition, which had the title Strange Angels. All of them kind of feature strange angels, apparently. And it took place in Dublin not long after he had graduated from college in London. Originally conceived as a visionary landscape in the manner of Samuel Palmer, Peter Young found that a childlike duck character kept on entering his consciousness. So he decided it had to be included. And it's seen here embraced by a mountain which has taken on human form. You can see kind of the two hands and the face in the background. And also, if you look at the foreground, you'll see that there kind of the angel is being embraced to some degree or protected by this large hulking figure who's paddling in water, and there's a tiny little fish nibbling at his toes. So a lot of Peter Young's work, there's kind of a whimsical element, I think, but they're really magical and delightful. Unlike the majority of Irish stained glass artists, most of Peter Young's commissions have been for non-religious settings and are secular in subject. However, in the mid-1990s, he created a pair of beautiful double-lancet windows for the gallery of a private neo-Gothic chapel adjoining a mansion in rural County Carlow. The owners, a couple, the Kavanaghs, had seen his Sure Enough the Duck panel in the Stained Glass Museum, and on that basis commissioned him to create a memorial window, or rather a pair of memorial windows, for their relative Martin Willis. Peter drew inspiration from a favourite poem of the deceased, which was Dylan Thomas's Fern Hill. In the first window, this one we're looking at, Young depicts a dreaming child on whose head a bird rests. And it's an image that actually came to Young himself in a dream. At the base, there is a babbling turquoise stream, while the background is filled with vigorously flowering blooms, and a squirrel pops into the frame. It's kind of, again, magical, otherworldly space. I'll just show you a detail of the little dreaming child. And if you look closely, you'll see the little bird and on its head, and the squirrel. And then the final image, which is positioned directly opposite its companion one, the previous one, so that the two windows almost appear to speak to each other, features a towering but benevolent Godhead figure constructed of plants standing on an emerald plinth, and in the background an expansive deep blue sea. The Godhead is derived in part from Peter Young's interest in African and Oceanic tribal art, looks across the chapel, keeping a watchful eye on the dreaming child, but also on the little figure down at the window's base. It's really small, and I hope you can see it. And this is actually Martin Willis, the man in whose memory the window's been erected. And he was a very keen gardener. And in the very extreme bottom corner, you'll see there's his beloved little garden with tiny, tiny little flowers. For Peter, this was a commission that was a joy to work on from start to finish. And it was, in his own words, and I was speaking to him yesterday, the best commission I ever had, which is great. And hopefully many artists can say that about, indeed, many, many works. So that concludes the whirlwind overview of 120 years of Irish stained glass. I hope it's been interesting and maybe not too madcap, but I have covered a lot of terrain. So at this point, I'll hand back to Jasmine, I think.
Thank you so much, David. Some absolutely exquisite images. Really nice to see the work of several artists, and of course, artists who really are producing some of the most exciting glass, I think, in the 20th century. So thank you so much, David, for showing us those images and talking us through the progression over time. It's nice to finish with Peter Young. We had not heard that story about the Stained Glass Museum panel leading to a commission. So that's really, really fantastic. And hopefully there are other windows out there that have been inspired from people visiting the museum's collection. You'd normally hear a round of applause at this point, David, and I'm sure people are beaming at homes because some fantastic, fantastic images, and really fabulous to see the details too. A plug for David's book before I take questions, because I know that many of these images are images in the book. It's one of the best features of the new edition is that it has these glorious colour images and up-to-date info. I'm going to pop in the chat just the title of the book and a link to the press. It's published by Irish Academic Press. We have been trying to get some copies for our shop, but to no avail so far. However, we do hope there will be some in the museum shop soon, so contact us if you want your friend's discount. The other link I'm putting there, just while I remember, is a lovely link to an article on the Tower of Glass if you want to know more about those. That was written by the late Nicola Gordon-Bow. And also Gloine, I hope I've said that right, the website devoted to stained glass in the Church of Ireland, which if you want to have a look at what else is in Ireland, well worth a look. So thank you, David. We'll go on to questions. Oh, there's some good ones coming in now. Okay. These might be difficult for you to answer, but I'm going to say them anyway. So Finola says, this is a well-curated collection, but who do you regret most not having time to include?
Oh, gosh. Yeah, well, that was a tough one. Oh, gosh, there are many, many more who I would have liked to included. One was Patrick Pollan, who was English born, as indeed was Patrick Pye, whose work I showed, and the two were very friendly. They were, I think, in both instances, a godfather to their respective children, and he produced wonderful work. It wouldn't have been as kind of, I wouldn't say as radical as Pye. He was a more conventional artist. He was inspired by Evie Home, and in fact, after he saw the window at Eton, which I showed the sketch design of, that it was on that basis that Patrick Pollan decided to move to Ireland and meet Evie Home, and he hoped to study under her, and there was a close relationship there, and indeed he worked at An Túr Gloine. He rented space there, but he produced wonderful work, some of which can be viewed in England, but most of his work is in Ireland. But he also did a huge series of windows for the new cathedral in Johannesburg. So that's one person I regret leaving out. One of many, I have to add.
Thanks, David. Similar vein question where you're being asked to kind of pick one place to visit in Ireland to see the best of Irish stained glass. Where would it be? Would it be Dublin or somewhere else?
Well, that's I'll suggest maybe two places, and ironically neither are in Dublin, even though I'm a Dubliner and I'm speaking from Dublin right now. The first one would have to be Loch Rey Cathedral, which I showed a few images from. St. Brendan's Catholic Cathedral, very kind of ordinary on a certain level, a neo-Gothic cathedral finished at the end of the 19th century, but that's where the stained glass movement began, really. It's got those 3 apse windows designed by Child, largely derived from designs by Wall, but it has a fantastic collection, particularly of Michael Healy. It has 10 of his windows, but quite a few more windows by A. Child, two by Evie Home, beautiful rose window, windows by Catherine O'Brien, Beatrice Elvery, people who I would like to have included in the presentation, but didn't have time to. And then the other location I would suggest, though all the windows were created really within a 2 to 3 year time frame, unlike Loch Rey, which spans 50 years. But the place I'm referring to is the Honan Hostel Chapel in Cork, which has that wonderful collection of Harry Clarke work in particular. There are 17 windows in total. I think I said 9 of them by Harry Clarke, including that such beautiful, elegant St. Gobnet window that I featured. And it really, that was when he burst on the scene. Like the windows, all of them are just astonishing. And it's a really interesting chapel because it's designed in a Hiberno-Romanesque style. And the windows by the An Túr Gloine artists are also very fine, it has to be seen. And it's a very coherent space as well. It all ties together. So there are 2 locations I would highly recommend.
And for other recommendations, you all need to get the Gazetteer because it's all in there.
True. Yeah, absolutely.
Have you got a copy there, David, that you can hold up?
Yes, I do. Of course I do.
Because I forgot to bring mine.
Yeah. Well, what I can do is I can show, just out of interest, this is the earlier version. I don't know if you can see that. This came out, as Jasmine said, in 1988. And it was quite modest and quite slim. There's a hardback version as well, but it only had about 800 entries or so, and was limited to Harry Clarke and the artists of An Túr Gloine. So when I was in touch with the publisher about a reissue, our idea from the outset was that it would be, people can see it, probably looks a bit dark, that it would be expanded as well as a revised. So it's got about 2,500 entries and a lot of photographs. And I think it's very kind of user-friendly as well. There
it absolutely is, yeah.
And there were 8 wonderful contributors whose names appeared at the start of the presentation, all a joy to work with, as was the amazing photographer Joseph Vertel, who took the vast majority of the photographs, especially for the publication. And we spent so many weekends driving around Ireland. He even went to offshore islands to photograph a stained glass window when I asked him to. So there was, despite COVID and everything, we managed to, capture some wonderful images across the island. And then we also included images that people kindly gave us and lent us from, or allowed us use of from overseas, as far away as New Zealand, for instance. So anyway, that's the new edition of the Gazetteer.
Fantastic. So we'll go back to a couple of questions after our mini advert break. Dan asks, is there much medieval glass in Ireland?
No. The short answer is no. Essentially none at all. Unlike England, where there would be many examples, we know there was medieval glass in Ireland, but with, I suppose, the dissolution of the monasteries and so on, everything was destroyed. So shards have been found. It's not known if any of it was actually created in Ireland. I don't think there's enough evidence based on the very small samples that have been found. There would be very small. There's a few kind of roundels, medieval roundels that were bought in from the Netherlands by wealthy individuals. I think Lord and Lady Londonderry have some incorporated into a window, but they weren't made in Ireland, and they were acquired in relatively recent times. So we have some 18th century glass, a lot of 19th century glass, and then also what the Gazetteer has focused on is glass from essentially 1900 up to the present day.
Thank you, David. Okay, we've got a few more questions now on kind of specific windows and artists. Leslie asks about the St. Michael and the Devil. I'm not sure which window he's referring to. Hopefully you know which one. He says it seems to have echoes of Epstein at Coventry. Is that possible?
Oh, yeah, that's an interesting point. Yeah, I think the one he's referring to is by George Walsh. It's the one that's in the Dublinia Interpretive Centre, former Synod Hall. So it at a glance, it looks like it's a religious building, and indeed it was. I must ask him, and it's possible that he's listening in. I'm not sure that he is, but I will inquire from him, because it's a very valid point, and it's a connection I hadn't made. But now that I hear it, I think, yes, that does make a lot of sense.
And one from me, and I've mentioned this to you before, I think, but it's very interesting when you look at both Geddes and Clarke's work in particular, the way that they play with scale within one window, often combine very large figures with very small figures, sometimes in a predella panel or in the background. And I can't think of any other artists that do that in the same way, nor can I think of a kind of really obvious, medieval precedent for that kind of scale, playing with scale, outside of the usual border and main panels. So is that a particular Irish feature? Do you know where it's coming from?
I think it probably is. I mean, Michael Healy would have done it as well. Certainly there are windows by him from his mid-career period where there's often very small vignettes, and several of the other An Túr Gloine artists as well. As to where it's coming from, I suppose with Healy specific, or with Clarke specifically, because he was an illustrator, he really relished working at a small scale, and that, maybe when he was working in stained glass, the scale was not dissimilar to the scale he was working on in terms of the illustrations he was creating for books. And whether Healy acquired that or from Clarke, possibly, I don't know. But it is quite prevalent in a lot of Irish windows. And indeed, many of the windows are for relatively small churches and are at a very accessible level. So they do really allow and invite the artist to delight in detail. And so the windows kind of act on a dual level. There's a principal figure often, and that has impact from a distance, but then you're drawn in close. And I think many of the An Túr Gloine artists were very interested, as was Harry Clarke, in narrative, the idea of storytelling, and providing information about the life of the artist. And sometimes, as in George Walsh, also very interested in storytelling and loads of little images that relate to the locality, the context, the community, and so on. So perhaps it is a very Irish thing.
Thank you. And one last question, which is an interesting question about Harry Clarke's work. I mean, was he ever seen as controversial? Ursula notes that many of his figures seem quite transgender, very interesting kind of figures that you can't always tell what gender they are. Was that ever controversial, or was his macabreness ever controversial at the time?
He had one very controversial window, and it was controversial more for its semi-nudity. And you recall I showed the Eve of Saint Agnes. Well, the other multi-panel window that he created of similar scale is the Geneva Window, and it in each of the panels, and there were a similar number, there were little vignettes taken from different Irish authors, poets, writers, playwrights, and so on. And one of them featured a semi-naked lady recumbent, and the window was commissioned by the Irish government, was meant to be a gift to the League of Nations building in Geneva. There was a space for it, and it was commissioned specifically for it, but it became very controversial, and ultimately it was decided not to send it, and it ended up in storage for a very long time, and ultimately Harry Clarke's widow acquired it back from the Irish government, and then a long time later it was acquired by the Wolfsonian gallery in Florida, where it is today. So it's a big loss for Ireland, but yeah, I mean, now it looks so tame. And in fact, there's a panel, I think a test panel for the particularly controversial panel, and it's only about 12 inches across by perhaps 8 inches high. That's on display right beside the Eve of Saint Agnes in Dublin City's art gallery. But it's the kind of thing you wouldn't think twice of nowadays. But I think many of the clergy in general were perhaps they were, he was such a talent that they could overlook a certain amount of the kind of very feminized men and so on. And, as long as they had angels or wings and halos and so on, and perhaps it appealed to some as well. So he was certainly very popular. His windows were very sought after. And after he died, there was huge pressure on the studio to continue to create the Harry Clarke windows. And that went on for years, for decades, in fact. So there was no shortage of interest. I'm sure at times he was required to tone down things a bit. But I think probably in his illustrations for books and so on, the macabre side got full vent and so on. And some of it is definitely erotic, not I wouldn't say any in a religious context, but if you look at some of the books he illustrated, it definitely would fall under the erotic umbrella. I won't go into it anymore, but I'm sure you'll find it on the internet if anyone chooses to Google it. But quite explicit images of genitalia and so on.
And in that remark, he's a bit kind of like Beardsley, isn't he? In that kind of group of illustrators.
Yes, definitely.
One final question, which I missed. Last one, I promised, David. Someone asks, how typical was it for students to move between studios, such as Harry Clarke and others?
Not at all, really. Well, I suppose that the two main ones I've been referring to is An Túr Gloine and the Harry Clarke Studio, and they were in competition. Certainly they were, as in the Honan Hostel, they was kind of upset that the plum windows went to Harry Clarke and not all of them went to An Túr Gloine, as was originally planned. But the artists themselves, no, not really. There was only one artist, a female artist, who I can think of, who worked in Clarke's for a bit and then was part-time in An Túr Gloine for a while. Quigley was her last name. And then she emigrated to South Africa, where she had a very long and productive career. But for the most part, the artists, once they joined, they seemed to stay with it, particularly with An Túr Gloine. One of the original artists, Catherine O'Brien, joined in 1903. She remained there even after the cooperative had been dissolved, but she remained at An Túr Gloine until 1963, a 60-year career. Though at that point, she was there on her own. It wasn't really An Túr Gloine as we understand the studio.
Fantastic. Well, as you can tell from the number of questions, a real great interest in this subject, David, and thank you so much for showing us some just a few highlights from what is a really extensive production of stained glass from Ireland, with some exquisite artists who stand out, internationally. So thank you very much, and do look up David's Gazetteer and get yourself a copy and visit when you can. Go out and see these windows. Hopefully the museum might be able to organise a trip once COVID things have cleared up. And hopefully, David, you might even be interested in joining us for that.
I would be delighted to, and thank you very much for inviting me to speak this evening. And I certainly enjoyed speaking about Irish stained glass, and thanks again for asking me.
Not at all. Thank you, David. And thank you to all of you who've joined us this evening. Just to once again thank you, because all your tickets go directly towards supporting the museum at this time, which is greatly appreciated. So thank you all, and take care. Good night.
Good night.